Welcome back to The Explainer. So let's just dive right into this, because today we are exploring a genuinely profound concept. I mean, it literally sits right at the intersection of brutal colonial history and our own modern everyday psychology. We're going to unpack something called the indentured servant archetype. And this is a journey that's going to take us all the way from the deadly, sweltering tobacco fields of the 1600s straight into the invisible mental chains that we actually put on ourselves today. But first, I really want you to ask yourself this core question. Have you ever felt totally trapped by a duty you didn't choose? Think about it for a second. Think about a time when you felt completely bound to a circumstance, maybe a dead-end job or even a relationship. A situation where your freedom just felt totally stripped away and you were forced to just sit there and endure it. Well, I want you to hold on to that feeling because we're going to unpack exactly where that psychological pattern actually comes from. But to understand the psychology, we kind of have to understand the historical blueprint first. So Section 1, History of the Bound Servant and the Harsh Realities of the 1600s. Okay, picture Europe back in the early 1600s. There was this massive population boom, which unfortunately led to extreme, grinding poverty. People were so absolutely desperate for a fresh start that they were literally willing to sell years of their actual lives just to pay for a ship's passage to places like the Jamestown settlements. These desperately poor folks signed contracts, indentures, that bound them to a master, usually for about 4 to 7 years. And take a look at the headright system. This was a brilliant but honestly terrifying legal loophole. The colonial government essentially handed out 50 acres of land to the master for every single servant they imported. So you can imagine this massively incentivized wealthy planters to just bring over as many bodies as possible, working them to the bone for 60 to 80 hours a week in these sweltering, mosquito-infested tobacco fields. And the thing is, this system was a meticulously crafted, inescapable trap. The legal system was completely rigged to extract the maximum amount of labor. Say a servant couldn't take the abuse anymore and tried to run away. Well, if caught, the courts would just slap extra years onto their contract. But the most horrifying structural abuse by far was directed at female servants. If a woman became pregnant, the law required her to serve 2 extra years. So think about what that actually means. It created this totally perverse, sickening incentive where a master could horrifically abuse his own servant and then actually be rewarded by the state with 2 more years of her free labor. Just awful. Now, it is absolutely crucial to understand how this system was different from the horrific institution of chattel slavery that eventually replaced it. Indentured servitude was, at its core, a form of debt bondage. The master owned the contract for your labor. They didn't own your actual person. And crucially, that contract had a finite end date. Chattel slavery, on the other hand, treated human beings as lifelong hereditary property. But for the indentured servant, that finite expiration date, the idea that it would eventually end, that's the defining core of their entire experience. But an expiration date really only matters if you actually live to see it. 40%. That is a grim statistic. That's the percentage of indentured servants who died from disease, starvation, and pure exhaustion before their contract was ever up. To put that into perspective, 4 out of 10 people who essentially sold their youth for a ticket to a better life were just worked to death in the dirt of the New World. They never even reached their freedom dues. And this brings us to a really fascinating shift. Section 2, the indentured servant archetype. Moving from that historical blueprint right into a psychological pattern. So based on the insights of author and medical intuitive Caroline Myss, these historical systems of intense human experience, they don't just vanish into the past. They actually evolve into active psychological patterns or archetypes that kind of live right there in our collective unconscious. The indentured servant archetype becomes active when someone feels completely bound, powerless, and just deeply stuck in a restrictive life circumstance. I mean, you aren't literally working in a tobacco field, right? But emotionally, psychologically, you feel exactly like that 17th century laborer, trapped by a contract you can't break, just putting your head down and enduring the days. We really need to clarify a super important emotional distinction here, and that's the difference between service and servitude. You see, true service is always done by choice. It's freely given from a place of personal autonomy. But servitude feels entirely forced upon you. When this archetype takes hold of your life, you definitely aren't choosing to serve. You feel like you have absolutely no other option whatsoever. So how exactly does this play out today? Let's move into Section 3, modern forms of indenturement, going from the literal physical examples to the deeply personal ones. While the laws have obviously changed, the literal physical practice of indentured servitude hasn't vanished at all. It's really just gone covert. The source material outlines how trafficked individuals are essentially modern indentured servants. We see it in privatized prisons where inmates are working for 30 cents a day just to keep corporate money flowing. We see it in migrant laborers in Dubai who are transported to construction sites and locked in compounds, or even captive workers from North Korea outsourced to make luxury fashion in hidden factories. That literal physical entrapment is sadly still a very active agent in the world right now. But for most of us, this archetype is going to express itself through incredibly heavy, unavoidable life circumstances. Think about the sudden, jarring reality of becoming a primary caregiver. Maybe it's providing round-the-clock end-of-life care for an elderly parent when there are literally no other siblings around to help, or standing by a spouse who was just diagnosed with dementia, or caring for a severely handicapped child. You love them, absolutely, but you also have to completely change the entire trajectory of your own life. You are effectively bound to that circumstance until the very end of that journey. When you're stuck in that deep exhaustion, it can honestly feel like a punishment. Like, why is this happening to me? But Caroline Myss offers this truly profound reframing. She says, I think the forces of life and love assign these contracts. She actually suggests that our souls agree to these immense burdens of caretaking. It's not a punishment, it's an assignment between souls, to be a witness and to be a caretaker for someone else's hardest chapter. And here is where the magic really happens. When you finally stop fighting the reality of your situation, when you can take a deep breath and say, okay, this is my assignment right now, your personality lines up with your soul. All that exhausting internal resistance just drops. And this unlocks what's known as the grace of endurance. Suddenly, you find this unexpected stamina flowing through you. It actually gives you the strength to endure a circumstance that previously felt completely crushing to your personality. Which brings us to the final piece of the puzzle, Section 4, Breaking Your Mental Chains, How to Set an Expiration Date on Your Fear. So what if your servitude isn't this noble act of caretaking? What if you are simply trapping yourself? Remember that historical distinction we talked about earlier between slavery and indentured servitude? The indentured servant always had a finite contract. That is the core hope of this entire archetype. Whether it's a physical burden like caretaking or just a psychological burden, it is contractual, meaning it is destined to end. The problem is, in our modern world, we sign invisible contracts with our own fears. We tell ourselves things like, man, I know I need to leave this toxic job or move out of this town, but I just don't have enough time yet. Or, I'll finally be free to live my life as soon as I have enough money saved up. You realize we sound exactly like those 17th century colonial laborers? We are literally waiting for a master, in this case, our own fear, to tell us our contract is up. So how do we get out? Well, the sources give us a pretty brilliant framework for this. Step 1, you have to actually acknowledge the fear that's keeping you in this holding pattern. Step 2, act like an indentured servant and give yourself a strict, non-negotiable contract end date. Tell yourself, I am breaking my contract with this place or with this mindset by this exact date. And step 3, which is honestly the hardest part, you have to act on your immediate intuition. When you get that gut feeling that it's time to go, you have to move, even without knowing exactly where you're going to land. Because, as the sources remind us, heaven never tells you what's on the outside until you get on the outside. Think about that. If you sit around waiting for a perfectly detailed map of your future before you dare to break your contract, you are going to be waiting forever. You only ever get the intuitive guidance to leave the room. You don't get to find out what's out there in the hallway until you are brave enough to actually walk through the door. Which leaves us with this final, vital question to ponder today. Where are you unconsciously signing away years of your life to fear, to excuses, or to circumstances you have completely outgrown? And more importantly, when are you finally going to set your expiration date and break your own contract? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I highly encourage you to take a hard look at the invisible chains in your own life.